Hey guys, today we're going to talk about political culture and its importance for foreign policy decision making. Now, according to realists, it's all about number one, your size, your military capacity, and of course the underlying economic basis that makes it happen, as well as the geopolitical neighborhood that you're in, external structures of the international system. Liberals focus on your internal institutions. Uh, are you a democracy? Do you have a free market economy? Do you have civil liberties guaranteed? That will affect your foreign policy behavior. Also, at the international level, liberals will look at to what extent a state is interconnected in a web of international institutions that will constrain the search for the self interest and make states more cooperative. However, what happens when you get two states who are in similar geopolitical conditions? They have the same size, they have the same democratic institutions, um, but their behavior is different. So, for instance, France and Germany, in fairly similar situations, not too different in terms of their size and capacity, both liberal democracies. But France is quite comfortable sending its military overseas on combat missions. Right now, the French are involved in anti Islamist operations in Northwest Africa, whereas Germans and the German government is often quite hesitant to send its military overseas on these combat missions. In the same kind of way, what if the external environment changes, but the behavior of the state doesn't change? So, for instance, after the end of the Cold War and the end of the US Soviet rivalry and the switch from a bipolar to a unipolar system, a lot of people expected that Japan, for instance, would start flexing its geopolitical muscles more. However, Japan, which had developed an identity as a peaceful Pacific trading power that would project its influence economically, it really hasn't changed its behavior all that much after the end of the Cold War. So this is where political culture comes in. That says, look, there are some things that realists and liberals can't explain. Now, how can we define political culture? Well, firstly, political culture is all about ideas. It's ideational. It's about the underlying beliefs, values, and norms in a society. So it's not about institutions or material capacity. It's about ideas that are floating around in society. And number two, it's got to be shared by most, if not all, members of a society in order to qualify as a culture. If it's not shared by most people, then you might call it an ideology, but it's not something that's widely shared. Um, Thirdly, it differentiates one country, one society, from another society. Um, it differentiates countries from each other. Each of them have a unique culture that they've developed. And lastly, culture is sticky. It changes slowly, if at all. Exceptions are after a national catastrophe like losing a war, for instance. But culture is sticky, like gum. It doesn't change very quickly. It can change, but it won't do so very quickly. So these are some of the defining characteristics of political culture. How does culture affect foreign policy? Well, first of all, culture shapes the collective goals that a society has. What are we trying to achieve? What is our mission in this world? Some countries have very strong sort of national goals. Other ones are not particularly clearly spelled out. But political culture does help define that. Secondly, political culture also shapes the perception of the external environment. Who is my friend? Who is my foe? This is to a large extent determined by political culture. Thirdly, political culture also determines the range of policy options that are possible. Now that we know who our friends and foes are, how we perceive our neighborhood, what can we do about it? What are the potential options that we have? And lastly, political culture can also help evaluate the costs and benefits of these different policy options. These are not these cost and benefit calculations are not simply based on simply objective reality, but they are transmitted through the subjective lens of countries' political culture. Now, when is political culture most likely to shape foreign policy behavior? When is it most likely to be important? When does it matter? And when is it less important? Well, scholars agree that typically national culture is particularly important when the external environment is ambiguous, unclear, um, particularly after a change in the international system. When things are clear, when you have a clear-cut bipolar system, here's this side, there's that side, oftentimes foreign policy decisions are externally determined, particularly if you have a smaller country that doesn't have that much wiggle room. But when the external environment is in a state of flux, it's not entirely clear to a country what kind of system we have, what kind of behavior we can expect from other countries. That is when national culture, internal domestic characteristics will be particularly important. Scholars also agree that when you have a country where decision making is not dominated by one particular group or one individual, then national culture is more important. So in democracies, national foreign policy decision making typically has to go through a longer process. There are more veto players that are part of the process. In an authoritarian regime, foreign policy decision making could depend simply on the idiosyncratic characteristics of an individual person. But even in a democracy, even when you have a very interesting, unique type of personality, President Trump definitely is such a person in America right now, still the democratic institutions constrain that individual. So in that kind of system, scholars argue, decision making may be more shaped by political culture. We can say foreign policy not dominated by one group of, we could say, actors. Lastly, when there is a united political culture and society is not divided into a bunch of subcultures, then national culture is going to matter more. When you have a society that is internally divided and one cannot really speak of one national culture, then of course it's not going to matter as much because there are more than just one culture in a particular country.